The conversation opens with an unnamed companion teasingly claiming that Socrates is eagerly chasing after Alcibiades. Socrates admits to being drawn to Alcibiades' youthful charm, but explains that his focus has shifted due to the presence of Protagoras in Athens, a man widely regarded as the wisest living thinker. For Socrates, wisdom now seems more alluring than mere physical beauty. He then recounts how earlier that morning, his young associate Hippocrates had roused him from sleep to share the news of Protagoras' arrival. Eager to gain wisdom, Sophia, Hippocrates hopes to study with Protagoras and suggests they go together to the home of Callias, who is hosting the famous Sophist. Socrates agrees, though since it is still quite early, he and Hippocrates first engage in a discussion about what exactly Hippocrates expects to gain from Protagoras. Their talk centers on the type of knowledge Protagoras might provide, and it soon becomes clear that Hippocrates hasn't really considered this deeply. Although he is aware that Protagoras is a sophist, Hippocrates insists he has no intention of becoming one himself. When pressed by Socrates to define what it is that sophists actually teach, Hippocrates suggests that they train people to become persuasive speakers, but he struggles to explain what kind of subjects or content those speeches would concern. Socrates warns Hippocrates to proceed carefully. Though he is ready to entrust the nourishment of his soul to Protagoras' expertise, he does not yet understand what exactly Protagoras offers. As Socrates observes, there's a troubling dilemma. One cannot judge the value of the sophist's instruction until one has received it, and by then, if the instruction turns out to be harmful, the damage has already been done. Nevertheless, Socrates proposes that they both go to Callias' house to listen to Protagoras firsthand, and to hear also from the other sophists currently in Athens, Hippias and Prodicus. Upon reaching the house, however, they initially face resistance. The doorkeeper, mistaking them for sophists themselves, refuses them entry. Socrates eventually convinces him otherwise, and they are admitted into the central hall, where Protagoras is encircled by his students. Hippias is there too, along with Prodicus, each surrounded by their own groups of followers. At first glance, the early scenes may seem only loosely related to the main philosophical exchange that follows. In truth, they serve as a subtle introduction to the essential issues explored in Protagoras. Socrates' temporary detachment from his pursuit of Alcibiades signals a shift in desire, an opening through which philosophy can enter. This redirection implies that engaging in philosophical thinking demands a change in orientation toward everyday life, even a kind of detachment from ordinary attractions, such as Alcibiades' beauty. Likewise, Socrates being woken from sleep is not just literal but symbolic. He is stirred from rest at the very moment someone else seeks enlightenment. Hippocrates wishes to be awakened to understanding, and the question arises, what is the best path to wisdom? Socrates' eagerness to assist reflects both his own philosophical impulse and his role as a guide, not just to Hippocrates but to us as readers, in grappling with how wisdom might be pursued. Yet by this point, the method of inquiry has already been established. Socrates' questioning dialogue, or dialectic, has shown its effectiveness in revealing flawed assumptions and prompting reflection. This dialectical process, it seems, offers a means of waking the mind to philosophical insight. This issue of method leads naturally into another key theme of the dialogue's beginning, the nature of sophistry and the distinction between different modes of reasoning. The moment when the doorkeeper mistakes Socrates for a sophist, while comical, is not without symbolic weight. Sophistry is, in a sense, likened to sterility, suggested through the image of the eunuch doorman. Just as the eunuch occupies an ambiguous sexual category, sophistry, too, seems vague in its goals and impact. To gain access to philosophical discourse, Socrates must distance himself from sophistry. Certain kinds of rhetoric may provoke suspicion from those guarding the intellect. Still, among Plato's works, Protagoras shows unusual respect for sophistry. Protagoras presents well-reasoned arguments and receives less mockery than many of Socrates' other opponents. Thus, the doorkeeper's confusion also hints at the deeper question: what, precisely, separates Socratic philosophy from sophistic teaching? Perhaps the most significant fusion of symbolism and philosophical purpose appears in the figure of the unnamed friend. The entire dialogue is framed as a recollection. Socrates is retelling past events to a companion. Yet this narrative structure is left unresolved. While the text opens with Socrates in conversation with his friend, it closes without circling back to that outer frame. We do not learn what the friend says in response to the account. This nameless figure is never clearly defined, leaving their identity open to interpretation. The absence of closure invites the reader to step into this vacant position. In this way, the friend becomes a placeholder, an empty role the reader is encouraged to fill. Protagoras thus begins with Socrates addressing someone, but it ends without confirming who that person truly is or what conclusion they are meant to draw. Socrates refers to a double obligation. He will speak, and the friend will listen, but this exchange remains incomplete. The openness of the ending subtly implies that the inquiry should not end with the text. Rather, it should continue into the reader's own life. As we read Protagoras, we effectively become that friend. Socrates gives us no final answer, but he offers something greater, a philosophical method, the dialectic or elenchus, which encourages the persistent questioning of easy conclusions. Socrates explains to Protagoras that both he and Hippocrates are interested in finding out whether Protagoras can help Hippocrates realize his ambition of becoming influential in Athenian public life. In response, Protagoras delivers an extended speech addressing the relationship between sophistry and public opinion. Many sophists, he claims, have concealed their profession beneath a respectable exterior, wary of how others might react to their perceived impact on youth. He suggests that poets, seers, musicians, and even athletic trainers have hidden their sophistic practice under the guise of more acceptable roles. In contrast, Protagoras asserts that he distinguishes himself by embracing the title openly. He is proud to call himself a sophist. For this reason, he proposes that their conversation take place in front of everyone present, and the room is rearranged to resemble a small theatre, setting the stage for the formal exchange. Protagoras then asks Socrates to restate the subject of their inquiry, and Socrates obliges, marking the official beginning of the central dialogue. He poses a straightforward question: what advantage will Hippocrates gain from studying with Protagoras? Protagoras replies that Hippocrates will improve daily and become a better man through his instruction. But Socrates points out that the term better assumes a standard of good that has not yet been clearly defined. He illustrates this through familiar analogies common in his method of inquiry. Just as painters teach students to become better at painting, and flautists train students to improve their playing, Socrates presses Protagoras to clarify: in what specific respect will Hippocrates improve under his tutelage? Protagoras responds succinctly, saying he teaches sound judgment in both private matters and public affairs. Socrates then reformulates this claim, stating that Protagoras is essentially offering instruction in political knowledge aimed at producing capable citizens. Socrates admits that he was unaware such a thing could be taught, which leads him to raise a foundational issue for the discussion. Can virtue be taught? He offers several reasons to doubt this. First, Socrates observes that in Athens, every citizen is allowed to participate in political decisions, suggesting that politics is not treated as a specialized craft, techne, like carpentry or navigation, which require formal training and experience. This suggests that virtue might not be the kind of thing that can be transmitted through teaching. Moreover, Socrates adds that even the most virtuous figures, such as Pericles, appear incapable of passing their excellence on to their sons or others. Given this, the idea that civic virtue can be taught seems doubtful, and Socrates challenges Protagoras to prove that it is indeed possible. To really understand how form and content interact here, it helps to look at how the dialogue treats sophistry and the idea of civic virtue. Interestingly, Protagoras' claim that he can teach people how to manage their private lives wisely is never seriously questioned, not here and not later on. He says he can teach someone how to run their household well, and Socrates lets that pass without comment. From here on, the argument shifts entirely to public life, how one behaves in the city, and private virtue is treated as if it doesn't matter. In a way, this gives Protagoras the home field advantage. Public and civic life is the very arena in which he claims expertise. And this separation between private and public is central to how Protagoras defines his approach. When Socrates asks whether he prefers to speak privately or in front of everyone, Protagoras chooses the public option without hesitation. The benches filled with onlookers inside the dialogue reflect this, but there's also us. The readers, by reading this conversation, we become part of the audience that makes Protagoras' openness real. To respond to Socrates' question about whether virtue can be taught, Protagoras tells a mythological story about how the gods created the animals. They assigned Prometheus and Epimetheus the task of giving each animal the traits it would need to survive. Epimetheus went first, distributing various strengths and defenses to different species: claws, speed, thick skin, and so on, so that each could protect itself from others. He also made sure every species had what it needed to deal with the environment and secure food. Finally, he set their reproductive capacities to match the rest of their traits, ensuring balance and sustainability for each kind. But when Prometheus reviewed what Epimetheus had done, he realized that humans had been left completely unprotected. No weapons, no shelter, no natural defenses at all. To fix this, Prometheus gave humans practical intelligence, knowledge of fire and basic survival skills. Still, this wasn't enough. Humans remained isolated, vulnerable to wild animals, because they hadn't yet formed communities. To solve this, Zeus stepped in and gave all humans a sense of justice and mutual respect, enabling them to live together in societies. Crucially, Zeus didn't give these civic traits to just a few individuals. He gave them to everyone. Communities can't function unless everyone understands basic social conduct. Along with this, Zeus laid down a law. Anyone who cannot live by these civic values should be put to death. The skills necessary for survival, farming, building, hunting, might belong to some, but the qualities that make social and political life possible are shared by all. According to Protagoras, the entire Athenian political system is based on this truth. Protagoras then turns to the topic of punishment and justice. Punishing someone just to get revenge makes no logical sense. The damage is already done and can't be undone. Instead, punishment serves a forward-looking purpose, to correct behavior and help citizens develop the qualities they need to live well in society: justice, piety, and the like. This understanding of punishment assumes that people can improve, that civic virtue is something teachable, and this idea sits at the heart of how Greek society works. Finally, Protagoras addresses Socrates' argument that virtuous fathers don't pass virtue on to their sons. That's simply false, he argues. Everything parents do to discipline and guide their children is aimed at teaching them virtue, and that process continues at school. Even the justice system contributes to this education, reinforcing the same values at a broader level. In this way, civic virtue is like language. It's not formally taught as a set of rules, but learned naturally by growing up within a community. Still, just as some people are better at teaching a language, some are better at helping others understand and live out virtue. Protagoras says he's one of those people, someone who can help others find the path to a virtuous life. When Protagoras asks his audience whether they'd prefer to hear a story or a logical argument, he hands over a crucial choice to them in how he presents his case that virtue can be taught. By drawing such a clear line between what he wants to say and the way he says it, treating the form of the argument as separate from its substance, he reveals a kind of indifference to the deeper role of philosophy. This reflects the general attitude often attributed to the Sophists, at least in the way Plato portrays them. For Plato, the way an argument is presented isn't just a matter of style. It should emerge naturally from the truth and structure of the ideas themselves. Earlier, Protagoras claimed he stood apart from other sophists because he didn't hide behind clever appearances. He openly shared his views. but by letting his audience choose the rhetorical format, he acts as if his ideas are merely performative, adjustable depending on who's listening. If choosing the most precise and honest way to express one's meaning is a kind of virtue, as Plato would surely argue, then ironically, Protagoras might be showing virtue by giving his audience the freedom to decide how he presents his argument. The only real support he offers for the claim that virtue can be taught is a cultural observation. Even the worst-behaved Greek is more virtuous than someone from a society without education, legal systems, or political structure. In his view, this comparison shows that Greeks are raised and shaped by their institutions to be virtuous. So if virtue depends on culture, then Protagoras, by asking his small society of listeners how he should argue, is actually connecting the form of his speech with the very nature of his topic. Still, he never actually proves that virtue is inherently teachable, nor does he truly attempt to. The main point of the first part of his speech is that virtue matters only within the context of society. It's a quality expected of all citizens. The second part raises the question of whether virtue is innate or acquired, but it doesn't answer it. Instead, it shifts focus to the idea that Greek society acts as if virtue can be taught, and everything in its political life is based on this assumption. On one level, Protagoras' willingness to defer to his listeners can be seen as evidence that he's a superficial or overly accommodating thinker. But at the same time, that very move shows how deeply his approach is guided by the values he's promoting. This kind of duality is essential to how Plato portrays him, as both a sophist, someone to be distrusted, and a genuine thinker worthy of attention. Socrates begins pressing Protagoras on his concept of virtue. Earlier, Protagoras had claimed that qualities like justice, temperance, holiness, and the rest aren't separate traits but are all aspects of a single thing, virtue. Socrates, using his usual back-and-forth style, starts testing how solid that claim really is. He argues that if virtue is made up of different parts, then those parts must have different roles, and just having one of them doesn't mean you automatically have the others. Socrates pushes this idea to an extreme, suggesting that each part of virtue, say, justice and holiness, is not just distinct, but totally unrelated. But that leads to an awkward conclusion. Justice wouldn't be holy, and holiness wouldn't be just. Protagoras pushes back, accusing Socrates of being unclear about what it means for things to be like each other. Just because two things share some features doesn't mean they're identical, or even very similar in any meaningful way. The debate fizzles out without a clear resolution. Socrates then shifts gears and tries to argue that temperance and wisdom are actually the same thing, a claim he makes with a bit more success. He also asserts that he has already shown holiness and justice to be the same, even though that part of the argument doesn't really hold up. Interestingly, Protagoras doesn't challenge him on it. Finally, Socrates tries to prove that justice is identical to temperance. As part of this discussion, Protagoras gives a brief explanation of his belief that good is a relative concept. Something is only good in relation to something else. But just as the conversation starts to pick up, it breaks down again, this time over the format of the discussion itself. Socrates complains about Protagoras' long-winded responses and insists on shorter replies. Protagoras refuses to continue if Socrates is going to dictate how he should speak, while Socrates refuses to go on unless Protagoras stops giving lengthy speeches. Then, claiming he has somewhere else to be, Socrates makes a move to leave. At this point, the spectators get involved. Callias takes Protagoras' side, while Alcibiades supports Socrates. One of the other sophists, Protagoras, gives a speech that tries to resolve the issue but ends up being overly pedantic and unintentionally funny. The third sophist, Hippias, gives a more pompous appeal for compromise. He suggests that Protagoras try to be brief and that Socrates allow for a bit of leeway. They all agree to appoint an informal moderator to keep the responses within reason. Socrates agrees to stay but suggests a structure for the conversation. Protagoras should go first and ask his questions, and then Socrates will take his turn. He adds that they don't really need a moderator. The audience itself can step in and call out if either speaker goes off track. The deeper issue of what a proper philosophical argument should look like, something that had been simmering under the surface, now comes fully into view, disrupting the conversation and nearly causing it to collapse. The contrasting methods used by Socrates and Protagoras no longer appear as different paths to the same goal. Instead, they seem incompatible, even hostile to one another. Neither man seems able, or perhaps willing, to genuinely engage with the other's approach. Socrates' rapid-fire questioning aims to pin Protagoras down by exposing flaws in his reasoning. He tries to construct chains of logic in which Protagoras agrees to the premises, only to be led to conclusions that contradict his own claims. But these attempts don't land particularly well. Socrates' arguments rely too much on shifting meanings, like his use of the word like, which Protagoras rightly points out as ambiguous. Meanwhile, the onlookers seem more taken by Protagoras' composed and eloquent speeches than by Socrates' sharp but brief questions. Still, Socrates manages to uncover something important. While Protagoras often speaks of virtue as if it's a clear and coherent idea, he never actually defines it, nor does he check whether he's using the term consistently. His style, more performance than logical demonstration, lets him gloss over the weak spots in his thinking. Rather than dissecting an argument step by step, Protagoras prefers big, persuasive speeches that sweep listeners along with the force of his rhetoric. At the end of one such speech, Socrates admits he's still caught in the spell of it. This kind of rhetorical enchantment is a recurring theme in Plato's dialogues, where sophistry is subtly criticized for charming the listener into passivity. Being under someone's spell, Plato suggests, is no way to engage in serious thinking. The flaws in Socrates' argument move quickly and are hard to pin down. The flaws in Protagoras' are dressed so elegantly that they're easy to miss. So are we to conclude that neither method has much value? That impression, however, is misleading. While Socrates' argument that virtue is a unified whole may seem like the focus, the real importance of this exchange lies in how the conversation itself falls apart. When Socrates responds to Protagoras' speech by saying he's convinced, only to immediately press him on whether virtue is one thing or many, it seems like a strange pivot. The connection between Protagoras' view of virtue as a socially shared quality and Socrates' probing of its internal structure isn't immediately clear, but Socrates does seem to have a strategy. His deeper aim is to challenge Protagoras' claim that virtue can be taught. That said, Socrates doesn't deny that virtue can be developed. He simply doesn't trust those who claim to sell it. Protagoras now takes control of the conversation and shifts the focus to lyric poetry. The discussion is still centered on virtue, but instead of exploring it in abstract terms, they look at how it appears within a specific poem. Both he and Socrates agree that a well-crafted poem should make sense as a whole. However, Protagoras claims that a poem admired by Socrates, one by Simonides, is internally inconsistent. At one point, the poet says it's hard to become a good person. Yet later in the same poem, he criticizes the sage Pittacus for saying that being good is hard, but this seems contradictory. How can a poem argue both that it's difficult to achieve virtue and also deny that it's difficult to maintain it? Socrates spends the rest of the discussion showing that this apparent contradiction disappears when examined more closely. In the process, he introduces a significant philosophical idea, that no one does wrong knowingly. His analysis starts by focusing on the different verbs used in the two lines. The first phrase is about becoming good, and the verb is in a past infinitive form, closer to saying, "It's hard to have become good at any point in time." This phrasing implies that being good is difficult, not just becoming good, and this ambiguity in the verb turns out to be a key point in the argument. Socrates concludes that because becoming and being are not the same thing, there's no contradiction in Simonides' poem. Protagoras pushes back. He argues that if Simonides is rejecting Pittacus' claim as false, then he must be saying the opposite, that being good is easy, and that, Protagoras insists, clearly isn't true. Socrates responds by playfully mimicking the hair-splitting arguments of another sophist, Protagoras, and builds a case that Simonides isn't saying being good is easy. He's actually implying it's impossible. So his criticism of Pittacus's phrasing isn't about ease versus difficulty, but about an unrealistic ideal. To back up this interpretation, Socrates turns back to the poem itself. He argues that the entire text should be seen as an indirect rebuttal to Pittacus. If we imagine Pittacus as speaking first, and Simonides replying, then the poem paints a picture where virtue is fragile, something people may reach briefly, but not sustain. Even the best of us falter when life takes a hard turn. What are those hardships? Socrates suggests they boil down to ignorance, not knowing what is truly good. In his view, the only real misfortune is a lack of knowledge. At this point, Socrates asks Protagoras how he'd like to continue. Should he now take his turn answering questions, or would he prefer to critique the argument so far? Either way, Socrates expresses a desire to move away from poetry. He argues that poetry isn't a reliable way to do philosophy, since the poet isn't present to explain their meaning or clarify their intent. In contrast, live questioning offers the opportunity to truly test ideas, and ourselves. Significant development in this part is that both Socrates and Protagoras acknowledge that Simonides' poem seems to contain a contradiction. For Protagoras, this contradiction marks the end of interpretation. He sees the inconsistency, lowers his opinion of the poem, and moves on to something else. Socrates, on the other hand, sees contradiction not as a stopping point but as an invitation. For him, the surface inconsistency is the very thing that demands deeper examination. It's not just contradiction that prompts this. Socrates' way of interpreting is guided by a careful attention to exactly where a poem's reasoning seems to falter. These moments of tension or confusion become openings where philosophical reflection can take hold, which is central to how Socrates thinks and works. In this light, Socrates' interpretive approach, as shown in this exchange, is an ideal example of his method. When we read the Socratic dialogues, we shouldn't just accept contradictions at face value. Instead, like Socrates, we should press further to uncover what might be hiding beneath them. This section, then, teaches us that philosophy is about continuing to ask questions, even when we feel we've reached a satisfying answer. A key part of this method is the need to consider the broader context in which a text exists. The contradiction Protagoras identifies isn't just an internal flaw, it points us outward, toward the surrounding ideas and debates that shaped the poem. So why does Simonides mention Pittacus in his poem? According to Socrates, it's because the poem is intentionally positioned against Pittacus's philosophical stance. In the previous part of their discussion, the very practice of Socratic questioning had been challenged. Now, Protagoras finds himself having to use that same question-and-answer style, though he tries to shift the focus to poetry, as if inserting a stable third element between himself and Socrates. But Socrates disrupts this move by uncovering a dialogue within the poem itself. For him, we can't fully grasp the poem unless we see it as responding to an external position. It's not just self-contained, it's part of an ongoing exchange with other ideas. In this way, contradiction and ambiguity aren't flaws to be fixed. They are signs pointing to the larger conversation in which the poem participates. Still, when Socrates resolves the contradiction that Protagoras noticed, he does more than just clarify the poem. He reshapes its meaning according to his own purpose. His interpretation is layered with irony, and his imitation of Protagoras' hair-splitting method of analysis hints that we should be cautious. After laying out his reading, Socrates ends by criticizing the very idea that interpreting poetry is a valid way to do philosophy. For him, real philosophical inquiry happens not through analyzing texts, but through direct dialogue. Even when poetry is treated as part of a conversation, it remains hypothetical and indirect. True understanding isn't found in written words. It must be spoken by people who live out the ideas they express. That's why Socrates insists that doing philosophy should test both the ideas being discussed and the people presenting them. If virtue can be captured in language at all, it can only be done by those who truly live it. So while Socrates offers a lesson on how to read Plato, he also makes a broader point. Reading, if it's just about grasping what an author meant, isn't enough. The aim of philosophy goes beyond interpretation. Knowing virtue isn't like knowing the meaning of a poem. It's something that can only be approached by testing ideas, and testing ourselves in the process. Socrates brings the conversation back to where it had been before the dialogue nearly fell apart. He reminds Protagoras, and us, that Protagoras had earlier claimed the 5 parts of virtue: wisdom, temperance, courage, justice, and holiness, aren't just different names for the same thing, but distinct elements that together make up virtue. Now, however, Protagoras somewhat pulls back from that view, probably because Socrates has revealed some weak spots in his argument. He concedes that maybe only courage really stands apart from the others. Socrates, still determined to show that virtue is one unified whole, sets out to prove that courage and wisdom are really just 2 names for the same quality. His first move is to distinguish between courage and mere boldness. Protagoras argues that some people can be courageous without being wise. But Socrates counters by suggesting those people aren't truly courageous, they're just bold. Courage, he says, involves a specific kind of knowledge. Boldness alone can stem from recklessness or madness, which clearly isn't a virtue. To challenge Socrates, Protagoras brings up a similar argument, trying to claim strength and wisdom are identical. Socrates responds by introducing what seems like a new topic. He'll return to courage's identity with the other virtues, but first he wants to explore how pleasure, knowledge, and the good relate. Socrates argues that pleasure and the good are the same, and that anything painful is evil. This means it's impossible to live a pleasurable life while doing evil. Although this goes against common sense, most people think it's easy to be tempted by pleasure into bad behavior. Socrates explains that many people simply can't judge well what will bring them lasting pleasure. Instead, they often sacrifice greater future pleasure for immediate but lesser gratification. Wrong actions, then, come from ignorance, not from a clash between duty and desire. What's needed is a skill or science, a technique, for measuring and comparing pleasures. Having gained Protagoras' agreement on this view of virtue, Socrates returns to courage. Facing something one truly believes to be terrible is a mistake, because it means choosing something likely to cause pain. Courage, Socrates says, is about correctly judging the danger at hand. Those who are bold but not courageous confuse what will harm them with what will benefit them. In fact, ignorance of what is dreadful and what is not is cowardice. Courage, as the opposite of cowardice, is therefore wisdom, and Protagoras reluctantly agrees. Socrates then sums up the whole discussion. Protagoras started by arguing that virtue can be taught, but ended by saying some virtues, like courage, aren't forms of knowledge and so can't be taught. Socrates, beginning with the opposite claim, tries to show that virtue is a single, unified thing, concluding that all virtues are forms of knowledge, and therefore teachable. But he also stresses that this discussion so far only clears the ground for further inquiry. The arguments need to be reconsidered, and the unanswered questions must be posed again. One way to interpret the ending of this dialogue is as a failure on Socrates' part. He has not succeeded in instilling virtue in anyone, nor have we gained a clear understanding of what virtue truly is. The conversation closes amid confusion and missed opportunities. Socrates even downplays Protagoras, saying he continued debating only out of respect for Callias, not out of respect for Protagoras himself. This sense of failure may serve as a subtle, grim allusion to Socrates' own fate, his judicial execution stemming from a widespread misunderstanding of his teachings. Yet this bleak reading is only part of the story. Socrates affirms that virtue can be taught, though how exactly to become virtuous remains unaddressed within the dialogue itself. Instead, this lesson is embodied by the form of the dialogue, the method of inquiry it employs. While the arguments do not produce firm conclusions, the dialectical process invites us to draw our own insights. The unresolved tensions here do not close the discussion, but instead shape how we interpret the entire work. In navigating these ambiguities, the dialogue challenges us to think deeply, turning its ending into a fresh starting point for ongoing reflection. This final section also presents a core element of Socratic philosophy, the idea that the good is knowledge, and therefore knowingly acting immorally is impossible. However, in making this case, Socrates assumes that all goods, such as health, wealth, or religious devotion, can be measured against a single standard that allows their competing claims to be fairly weighed. This assumption contrasts sharply with the broader Greek cultural context, especially as dramatized in classical tragedies. Plays like those of Sophocles often explore the clash between competing ethical demands. For example, Antigone faces a painful choice between her loyalty to family and her duty to the state. If such conflicts could be easily compared and resolved by weighing the greater good, the tragic power of these stories would dissolve. The drama would reduce to a simple moral lesson on how to resolve conflicting duties. Indeed, if Socrates' argument were accepted in full, the very idea of conflicting moral claims would seem nonsensical. Ethical decisions would become straightforward calculations about which choice brings the greatest pleasure. Acting rightly would be as simple as measuring and adding up pleasures to select the best option. But if virtue were this simple to practice, why then would one need to study under a sophist like Protagoras to become virtuous? In a sense, the question Socrates posed at the outset, whether virtue is teachable, has been answered. It is teachable. But the inquiry into Protagoras himself reveals that while virtue can be taught, Protagoras is not the right person to do so. Moreover, virtue is not something that can be taught in a straightforward way. If virtue is a kind of knowledge, we must first understand the nature of that knowledge before we can know how to teach it. As with much in this dialogue, the unresolved issues push the reader to reflect on questions of form and method. The absence of a definitive conclusion invites us to consider how we ourselves are learning through the dialogue. The form through which we come to know virtue is the dialectic, the method of questioning that exposes ignorance and guides us toward fundamental truths. To uncover truth, Socrates requires an interlocutor who holds mistaken beliefs. The path to truth begins with confronting falsehood. If Protagoras offers no certain answers, this does not mean failure, but signals the need to continue the intellectual journey Socrates initiates. The reader is called to actively engage with the text. Many questions remain open, some characters' replies go unheard. These gaps demand that we read Protagoras attentively and thoughtfully. The process of reading mirrors and extends Socratic dialectic. As Socrates says in closing, he wishes to work through the entire matter until we finally understand what virtue is, and then reconsider whether it can be taught. The task remains unfinished. It falls to the reader to take up this philosophical work.